For nearly 40 years, Margaret Whitmore measured her life not in birthdays or holidays but in mornings that began long before dawn. When the world outside still slept and the streets were wrapped in that quiet blue darkness that belonged only to bakers, newspaper carriers, and people who understood devotion better than comfort. And every day she unlocked the doors of Whitmore Bakery with the same small brass key her husband, Daniel, had once handed her on the day they opened, joking that whoever held the key held their future, though neither of them realized then how true those words would become. The bakery stood on a modest corner surrounded by aging brick buildings and stubborn little shops that refused to disappear despite changing times. And inside it carried the warmth of decades, polished wooden counters worn smooth by thousands of hands, glass cases that reflected golden morning light, and the steady hum of ovens that seemed almost alive, breathing warmth into the space as if the building itself possessed a heart. Margaret remembered the early years vividly, when she and Daniel worked side by side through exhaustion and uncertainty, counting coins at night to make sure they could afford flour for the next morning, laughing when recipes failed, celebrating quietly when customers returned again and again. Because loyalty meant survival in those days, and survival slowly turned into success not through luck but through consistency, kindness, and the simple belief that people could taste sincerity in food made with care. Their sons grew up among sacks of sugar and the smell of rising dough, doing homework at corner tables while Margaret shaped pastries and Daniel told stories to customers who stayed longer than they intended just to listen. And Margaret believed with unwavering certainty that the bakery was more than income. It was inheritance, not measured in money but in purpose. Something meant to pass gently from one generation to the next, like a family recipe written in careful handwriting. When Daniel passed away after a brief illness that felt cruel in its suddenness, the bakery became both Margaret's refuge and her grief, a place where memories lived loudly enough to keep loneliness from settling completely. And although her sons insisted she step back and let them handle operations, she continued arriving each morning, tying on her apron and offering suggestions that came from decades of experience. Adjustments so small they seemed invisible yet mattered deeply: a minute less in the oven, a different supplier for butter, greeting regular customers by name before they spoke. Because Margaret believed business was built on remembering people, not just serving them. At first, her sons welcomed her presence, praising her wisdom and reassuring customers that nothing would change. But slowly the rhythm shifted in ways subtle enough to confuse her before they hurt her. Meetings began happening behind closed office doors. Conversations paused when she entered rooms, and decisions appeared already finalized, presented to her not as discussions but announcements delivered with careful politeness, as though disagreement from her would be inconvenient rather than valuable. She told herself this was natural, that every generation needed space to lead differently. Yet small details unsettled her. New packaging designs she had never seen approved, recipes adjusted to follow trends rather than tradition, employees who once asked her advice now looking uncertain about whether they were still supposed to. The first time one of her sons gently took the mixing bowl from her hands and suggested she take it easy, she laughed, assuming it was kindness, but the phrase repeated itself over weeks until it no longer sounded affectionate but final. And Margaret began noticing how often she was encouraged to sit rather than participate, observe rather than decide, smile rather than guide, until she felt like a visitor watching strangers carefully preserve a version of her life that no longer required her presence. Customers still greeted her warmly, though some hesitated before speaking, glancing toward her sons as if unsure whether conversation with her interrupted business. And Margaret started leaving earlier each day, walking home through familiar streets carrying a fatigue that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with displacement. Evenings grew quieter without Daniel's laughter to soften them, and she found herself replaying memories of the bakery's beginnings, reminding herself she had built something lasting, something strong enough to survive change. Yet beneath that reassurance lived a question she refused to voice aloud: when does helping become interfering? And when does stepping aside become disappearing? The answer arrived one Sunday evening when her sons invited her to dinner, setting the table carefully and speaking with unusual gentleness, their concern wrapped so neatly in affection that Margaret sensed the conversation's destination before it began. And as they explained that she deserved rest after decades of hard work, that a retirement community would offer companionship, safety, and comfort, she watched their expressions closely, noticing how they avoided mentioning the bakery directly. How every reassurance focused on her well-being while quietly removing her from the center of the life she had built. They described cheerful rooms, organized activities, attentive staff, and freedom from responsibility, painting retirement as reward rather than relocation. And Margaret listened without interruption, folding her hands in her lap the way she had learned to do when emotions threatened clarity. Because somewhere beneath their careful words, she recognized not cruelty but convenience, the soft efficiency of people solving a problem they believed necessary. She nodded slowly, offering a small smile that surprised even herself, and agreed to consider it, though deep inside she felt something shift, not breaking. Not yet, but loosening like a thread pulled gently from fabric whose strength depended on its presence. That night she walked alone through the bakery after closing, touching counters, straightening chairs, and pausing beside the old oven Daniel once repaired himself during a winter storm when they could not afford replacements. Memories rising around her so vividly she could almost hear his voice telling her that ownership meant responsibility not only to others but to oneself. And she realized with sudden clarity that while her sons believed they were helping her step away from work, they were also stepping into authority they assumed already belonged to them. Margaret turned off the lights one by one before locking the door, holding the brass key a moment longer than usual, unaware that this quiet evening marked the beginning of a decision that would change not only her future but theirs as well. The move to the care home happened faster than Margaret expected. Arranged with efficient kindness by her sons who handled paperwork, packed her belongings, and reassured her at every step that this was only the beginning of an easier chapter. Yet as she sat in the passenger seat watching familiar streets slide past the window, she felt less like someone starting anew and more like someone being carefully folded out of a life that continued without her. And though the facility itself was pleasant, sunlight streaming through wide windows, polished floors reflecting soft laughter from residents gathered in common rooms, nurses greeting her warmly by name, the comfort felt curated rather than earned, as if everything around her had been designed to replace purpose with distraction. Her room overlooked a small garden where trimmed hedges formed perfect shapes and benches invited quiet conversation. But Margaret noticed immediately that nothing there carried history. No flower dust lingered in corners, no smell of cinnamon drifted through the air. No evidence existed that struggle had ever lived within those walls. And she unpacked slowly, placing photographs of Daniel and the bakery on a small dresser, trying to anchor herself to memories that felt suddenly fragile outside their natural setting. The days settled into routine with surprising speed. Mornings marked by scheduled breakfasts, afternoons by activities she politely attended, evenings by television programs chosen collectively by residents who spoke often about the past but rarely about the future. And Margaret listened kindly to their stories while feeling an invisible distance between herself and the acceptance many of them seemed to carry. Because she did not feel finished, only paused. Her sons visited regularly at first, bringing flowers and updates delivered in cheerful summaries that lacked detail, telling her the bakery was doing well, that business was improving, that new ideas were attracting younger customers. And she smiled, proud yet oddly excluded, sensing that each visit offered reassurance without invitation, information without involvement. She asked small questions, how the staff were doing, whether Mrs. Alvarez still came every Tuesday for her raisin bread, if the old mixer had finally been repaired, and their answers grew shorter over time, not intentionally dismissive but hurried, as though operational specifics no longer belonged to her world. One morning, after several weeks had passed, Margaret woke before sunrise out of habit and sat by the window watching the sky brighten, her hands restless without dough to knead or ovens to prepare. And she realized she missed not only the bakery but the responsibility it demanded, the quiet satisfaction of being needed. So she requested permission from the staff to take an outing, explaining anticipation mixed with nervous excitement, her steps slowing when she noticed subtle differences even from a distance: brighter signage, redesigned windows, decorative lights she did not recognize, changes she tried to interpret as progress rather than replacement. But when she stopped directly in front of the shop, her breath caught because the painted lettering across the glass now read simply, Whitmore's, the word bakery smaller beneath it. And her first name, once written proudly as Margaret Whitmore's Family Bakery, had disappeared entirely, leaving behind a polished anonymity that felt deliberate. She stood there longer than she intended, watching customers enter and leave without recognizing her presence, until finally she pushed open the door and stepped inside. expecting familiarity to comfort her, only to feel disoriented by the transformation. The layout remained similar, yet everything seemed curated toward trend rather than tradition. Minimalist displays replacing crowded warmth. Pastries shaped for photographs rather than comfort. Music playing softly where once conversations filled the air. The scent was still sweet, but different, lighter somehow. Missing the richness she associated with recipes perfected over decades. A young employee behind the counter greeted her with a practiced smile and asked what she would like to order. And Margaret hesitated, waiting for recognition that never came. Realizing the girl had likely been hired after her departure, and when she introduced herself gently, the employee's polite confusion revealed that Margaret's story had already begun fading from daily memory. She ordered tea and sat at a corner table where her sons once completed homework, observing quietly as operations unfolded with efficiency but without the small rituals she had believed defined the bakery's soul. No handwritten notes tucked into regular customers' bags. No spontaneous laughter from the kitchen, no lingering conversations that turned strangers into community. Staff members worked quickly, professionally. Yet the atmosphere felt transactional, as though the bakery had become successful by forgetting the imperfections that once made it human. Margaret eventually rose and walked toward the kitchen entrance, instinct guiding her steps, only to be stopped kindly but firmly by an employee who explained that access was restricted to staff. And though the rule made sense, the moment landed with unexpected force. Because for the first time in 40 years, she required permission to enter a space she had built with her own hands. She apologized softly and stepped back, her composure intact but her understanding sharpened. And as she prepared to leave, she noticed a display featuring new signature recipes, each labeled with modern names unfamiliar to her. Adaptations of creations she recognized instantly beneath their altered presentation. And she realized then that evolution had not included acknowledgement. Her legacy had been edited rather than honored. Outside, Margaret sat on a nearby bench watching the bakery through the window. Customers laughing, employees moving confidently. Life continuing smoothly without her presence. And instead of anger, she felt clarity settle gently within her. A realization that her sons had not simply encouraged retirement, but had rewritten ownership in practice if not in law. The thought lingered quietly until memory guided her toward a detail Daniel had once insisted upon during difficult early years. When financial advisors recommended transferring assets for convenience and he refused, saying security meant keeping final authority where trust and history lived. And Margaret suddenly remembered the folder stored carefully among her belongings. Documents she had preserved more out of habit than intention. She returned to the care home that afternoon thoughtful rather than upset, carrying with her not resentment but awareness, and that evening she opened the folder, adjusting her glasses as she reviewed page after page until the truth became unmistakable. Despite management changes and assumptions made by everyone around her, legal ownership of Whitmore Bakery remained entirely hers. Margaret closed the folder slowly, her reflection faintly visible in the window beside her. And for the first time since moving into the care home, she felt something awaken, not revenge, not even anger, but agency, the quiet understanding that while others had decided what role she should play in the final chapters of her life, the story itself was still hers to write. Margaret did not act immediately after discovering the documents, because decades of running a business had taught her that the most powerful decisions were rarely made in moments of emotion but in patience, observation, and timing. So she returned the papers carefully to their folder and resumed her routine at the care home as though nothing had changed. Attending morning tea, smiling through conversations, and allowing her sons to continue believing she had fully settled into retirement. Yet beneath her calm exterior, her thoughts moved steadily, examining memories and possibilities with the same care she once used when perfecting a recipe, adjusting small details until balance appeared. Each evening she reviewed the ownership documents again, confirming what she already knew. Daniel had structured the business so that Margaret retained sole legal authority, a safeguard meant to protect her security should anything unexpected happen. And she remembered laughing at his caution years earlier, never imagining that provision would one day restore her independence rather than merely preserve it. Instead of confronting her sons, Margaret began asking quiet questions during her visits to the bakery, returning occasionally under the pretense of nostalgia, observing operations with a sharper awareness now that she understood her position, noticing financial shortcuts disguised as modernization, suppliers changed for cheaper alternatives, and employees who worked harder but seemed less connected to the place itself. She spoke gently with staff members when opportunities arose. Learning who remained loyal not out of obligation but affection for what the bakery once represented. And one name surfaced repeatedly in her observations: Elena Morales. A young woman who arrived early, stayed late, and treated customers with the same attentiveness Margaret recognized from her own younger years. Elena greeted everyone warmly, remembered preferences without writing them down, and corrected small mistakes quietly rather than assigning blame. And Margaret found herself watching her with growing curiosity, sensing not only competence but care. One afternoon, Margaret struck up a longer conversation with Elena while waiting for tea. And the young woman spoke openly about loving the bakery yet worrying about its direction, explaining how rapid changes sometimes ignored what longtime customers valued most. Though she expressed these concerns respectfully, never criticizing management directly, and Margaret listened carefully, recognizing sincerity rather than ambition. Elena mentioned learning recipes from older staff members before they left, trying to preserve traditions even as menus evolved. And Margaret felt an unexpected warmth at hearing someone still speak about the bakery, as though it possessed identity rather than branding. When Elena asked politely whether Margaret had once worked there, unaware of her full history, Margaret smiled and replied only that she had spent a great deal of her life inside those walls, leaving the conversation with confirmation she had not been searching for but quietly hoped to find someone who understood stewardship instead of ownership as privilege. Back at the care home, Margaret began making phone calls, scheduling appointments under the guise of organizing personal affairs, contacting a lawyer Daniel had trusted years before, now older but still practicing, who greeted her warmly and reviewed the documents with professional thoroughness before confirming what she already believed: she possessed full authority to sell, transfer, or restructure the business at her discretion. The lawyer asked gently whether family members were aware of her intentions, and Margaret answered honestly that they were not, explaining she wished to proceed carefully to avoid unnecessary conflict, though privately she knew the conflict already existed, only unspoken. Together they discussed options: corporate buyers, franchise opportunities, external investors, but none appealed to her because Margaret did not want the bakery absorbed into something impersonal. She wanted continuity shaped by respect. Over the following week, she arranged discreet meetings outside the care home, assisted by staff who admired her independence. And during one such meeting, she invited Elena for coffee, presenting the invitation casually enough to avoid suspicion yet deliberately enough to signal importance. Elena arrived nervous, unsure why she had been asked, and Margaret spoke slowly, sharing stories about the bakery's origins, Daniel's dreams, and the philosophy that guided every decision they once made. Watching carefully as Elena listened, not with impatience but reverence, asking thoughtful questions and expressing genuine admiration for the legacy she had unknowingly inherited responsibility for protecting. Finally, Margaret revealed the truth, that she remained the owner, and the shock on Elena's face quickly shifted into concern, as though she feared she had accidentally participated in disrespect without realizing it. Margaret reassured her gently before explaining her intention to step fully away from management but not from meaning. And she asked Elena a question that lingered heavily between them: if given the chance, would she preserve the bakery's spirit rather than simply expand its profits? Elena hesitated, overwhelmed by the implication, admitting she had never imagined such responsibility, yet promising she would protect what made the bakery special if ever entrusted with it. That sincerity settled Margaret's remaining doubts, because she recognized the same mixture of fear and determination she herself felt decades earlier when opportunity first arrived disguised as risk. The legal process unfolded quietly after that. Contracts drafted with confidentiality clauses, valuations completed without alerting her sons, and Margaret approached each step not with secrecy born of malice but with certainty that confrontation beforehand would transform resolution into argument. She spent evenings reflecting on motherhood alongside leadership, acknowledging that love for her sons remained unchanged even as disappointment reshaped her understanding of them. And she wondered whether they truly intended harm or simply allowed ambition to overshadow gratitude, concluding finally that intention mattered less than consequence. Selling the bakery became less an act of retaliation and more an act of restoration, ensuring the business returned to hands guided by care rather than entitlement. On the morning she signed the final agreement transferring ownership to Elena, Margaret felt an unexpected calm, as though a weight she had carried invisibly since Daniel's death finally lifted. And after placing her signature on the last page, she closed her eyes briefly, imagining him standing beside her approving quietly, proud not of the decision itself but of her willingness to claim agency when it mattered most. The lawyer congratulated her, paperwork finalized, transition scheduled to take effect within days. And Margaret returned to the care home that afternoon, appearing unchanged to everyone around her, knitting by the window, greeting visitors warmly, and listening patiently as her sons later called to share enthusiastic updates about expansion plans already underway, plans that, unbeknownst to them, no longer belonged to their future. And for the first time since agreeing to leave the bakery, Margaret slept deeply, not because her life had grown smaller, but because she had quietly taken control of its direction once again. The transition began on an ordinary Tuesday morning, the kind Margaret knew well from decades of routine, when nothing in the air suggested change, yet everything beneath the surface had already shifted. And while she sat in the care home dining hall stirring sugar into her tea, across town Elena unlocked the bakery doors, not as an employee arriving early for another shift, but as its new legal owner. The realization settling over her with equal parts excitement and disbelief as she reviewed documents signed only days earlier, her hands trembling slightly before she steadied herself the way Margaret had taught her during quiet conversations: breathe first, decide second. The staff arrived gradually, unaware that history had turned overnight, greeting Elena casually until she gathered them together and explained, voice careful but firm, that ownership had officially changed and operations would continue with respect for tradition as well as thoughtful improvement. And confusion filled the room before curiosity replaced it. Because, unlike corporate takeovers that often carried layoffs and uncertainty, Elena spoke not of restructuring but of restoration, promising stability, listening, and collaboration. Margaret's sons arrived later that morning expecting routine familiarity, discussing inventory numbers as they approached the entrance. But hesitation slowed their steps when they noticed subtle differences already appearing. The old, framed photograph of Margaret and Daniel restored to its original place near the register, handwritten menu cards replacing printed promotional boards, and employees gathered together in conversation rather than scattered hurriedly across tasks. At first they assumed changes were temporary adjustments until Elena approached them calmly and requested a private discussion, guiding them toward the office where official documents waited neatly arranged on the desk. She explained the situation professionally, presenting paperwork confirming the completed sale. And for several long seconds neither man spoke, disbelief suspending comprehension as though language itself had failed them. Questions came quickly after that, confusion turning into frustration, frustration sharpening into anger, and they demanded explanation, insisting there must be a mistake, that decisions of this magnitude required their involvement, only to discover legally they held managerial roles, but no ownership authority. A distinction they had overlooked because assumption had replaced verification. Elena remained respectful, repeating only facts, explaining that Margaret had exercised her legal rights and ensured continuity through private agreement. And though she expressed appreciation for their work managing operations, future roles would now depend on alignment with the bakery's renewed direction. The conversation ended without resolution, tension lingering heavily as employees pretended to focus on tasks, while quietly absorbing the reality unfolding around them. Within hours, Margaret's sons drove directly to the care home, emotions fueled by shock more than reflection, rehearsing arguments during the journey that dissolved the moment they saw their mother seated peacefully by the window, sunlight resting gently across her knitting as though nothing extraordinary had occurred. Margaret greeted them warmly, setting aside her work and listening patiently as questions tumbled over one another. How could she sell the bakery? Why had she hidden the decision? Didn't she trust them? And she allowed their words to finish before answering, her voice calm not from indifference but certainty earned through careful thought. She explained that ownership had always remained hers, that she believed the bakery needed guardianship rooted in respect for its origins, and that retirement, as they encouraged it, meant releasing responsibility entirely rather than remaining symbolically attached to decisions she no longer influenced. Her sons argued they had only wanted what was best for her, insisting the care home prove their concern, and Margaret nodded gently, acknowledging their intentions without surrendering her perspective, explaining that comfort offered without consultation often becomes control disguised as kindness. She described visiting the bakery and discovering her name removed, recipes altered without acknowledgement, and boundaries placed around spaces she once built. Moments that revealed she had not been invited to rest but quietly replaced. Silence followed as realization settled unevenly between them. Not immediate acceptance but the uncomfortable recognition that love and dismissal had existed together in ways none of them fully examined before. Finally, one of her sons asked what would happen now. Whether she intended to cut them out completely, and Margaret reached forward, placing her hand over his with the same tenderness she used when comforting them as children, assuring them the sale was not punishment but consequence. An opportunity for everyone to reconsider what inheritance truly meant. She explained that Elena valued the bakery's legacy and would decide future roles fairly, encouraging them to prove their commitment through effort rather than expectation. Because leadership, she reminded them softly, was never guaranteed by blood alone. The words carried no accusation, only truth spoken without anger. And that absence of hostility unsettled them more deeply than confrontation might have. After they left, Margaret returned to her seat by the window, watching clouds drift slowly across the afternoon sky, feeling neither triumph nor regret but balance, as though a long unfinished conversation with herself had finally reached conclusion. Later that evening, Elena called to thank her again, describing how customers reacted warmly to small restorations already made, how longtime visitors smiled upon seeing familiar recipes return, and Margaret listened quietly, satisfied not because control remained hers, but because stewardship had found new hands willing to carry responsibility forward. When the call ended, she resumed knitting, each movement steady and deliberate, aware that for the first time since Daniel's passing she no longer felt defined by absence or displacement. Across town, the bakery continued operating under new leadership, conversations buzzing with speculation and adjustment, while Margaret's sons sat together reviewing choices they had never questioned before, confronting the difference between managing something and truly understanding it. And though uncertainty filled their future, possibility existed there too, the chance to rebuild trust not through entitlement but humility. And as evening settled gently over the city, Margaret closed her eyes briefly, feeling an unfamiliar lightness, because the decision she made had not ended her story but restored its authorship, allowing her life to move forward on terms shaped not by others' expectations but by her own quiet resolve. In the weeks that followed, life unfolded with a calm steadiness Margaret had not felt in years. Not because everything around her had become perfect, but because uncertainty no longer belonged to her decisions. And each morning she woke in the care home with a sense of ownership over her time rather than the lingering feeling of being placed somewhere by someone else's plan. Word of the bakery's transition spread quietly through the neighborhood, carried by regular customers who noticed familiar flavors returning in conversations, lingering once again near the counter. And Elena worked tirelessly to balance preservation with growth, restoring handwritten recipe cards, inviting former employees back for visits, and creating a small display honoring Margaret and Daniel's story so new customers would understand the foundation beneath every loaf of bread they purchased. Margaret visited occasionally, never announced, sitting at a corner table with tea while watching the rhythm of the bakery rediscover itself, and this time no one stopped her from walking into the kitchen. Instead, Elena welcomed her warmly, asking for advice not out of obligation but respect. And Margaret offered suggestions sparingly, careful not to reclaim authority she had intentionally released. Her sons stayed away at first, pride and confusion keeping distance between them and the place they once believed guaranteed their future. Yet reality gradually softened anger into reflection. And one afternoon they arrived separately, uncertain whether they were welcome, only to find Elena treating them with professionalism rather than resentment, offering opportunities to remain involved if they chose to adapt to the bakery's renewed values. The adjustment proved difficult, requiring them to listen instead of lead, to learn traditions they once overlooked, and slowly they began understanding that their mother's decision had not removed them from the story but rewritten their role within it. Conversations with Margaret during subsequent visits grew quieter and more honest, no longer framed by persuasion or defense but curiosity, and they asked questions about the bakery's early struggles, stories they had heard as children yet never truly absorbed. Realizing how much effort and sacrifice existed behind what they once considered inevitable inheritance, Margaret never reminded them of mistakes directly. Instead, she shared memories, sleeping on flour sacks during financial hardship, repairing equipment by hand, memorizing customers' preferences because loyalty meant survival, allowing understanding to form naturally rather than through accusation. And through those stories, her sons began recognizing the difference between receiving something and earning responsibility for it. Gradually, visits to the care home shifted from obligation to companionship, laughter returning to conversations that once carried tension. And though wounds did not vanish instantly, they healed through patience rather than confrontation. Meanwhile, Margaret herself discovered unexpected freedom within her quieter life, forming friendships with residents she had once viewed only politely, organizing small baking afternoons in the facility kitchen where she taught simple recipes to anyone willing to learn. And she realized retirement, when chosen rather than imposed, could become expansion rather than ending. Residents spoke proudly of Margaret's classes, and staff noticed how energy returned to her posture, how purpose reshaped her days without demanding exhaustion. And she understood at last that stepping away from ownership did not mean abandoning identity. It meant redefining it. One late afternoon, several months after the sale, Elena invited Margaret to a small gathering at the bakery celebrating its anniversary. And when Margaret arrived, she found the shop filled with familiar faces, longtime customers, employees old and new. Even her sons standing near the counter arranging trays together, and above the entrance hung a restored sign reading Whitmore Family Bakery. Her name returned not as possession but tribute. Elena gave a short speech thanking Margaret for building something strong enough to survive change, describing the bakery as proof that legacy lived not in control but in care passed forward. And Margaret listened quietly, emotion rising gently rather than overwhelmingly. Because recognition felt different when it arrived freely. As the evening ended and guests slowly departed, Margaret stepped outside alone for a moment, breathing in the cool air while watching lights glow warmly through the bakery windows. Remembering the countless nights she and Daniel once stood in the same spot wondering whether their dream would last another year. And she realized with peaceful certainty that it had lasted not because she held onto it forever, but because she knew when to let it continue without her. Her sons joined her eventually, standing beside her in comfortable silence before one of them asked softly whether she regretted selling the business. And Margaret smiled, shaking her head as she looked back at the bakery alive with conversation and laughter. "You told me it was time to retire," she said gently, her voice carrying neither bitterness nor triumph, only quiet truth. "And you were right. I just needed to decide what that meant for myself." They laughed softly together, the tension that once divided them replaced by understanding still growing but genuine. And as Margaret walked toward the car waiting to take her back, she felt lighter than she had in years, not because she had won anything, but because she had chosen dignity over resentment, purpose over silence. The bakery continued behind her, thriving under new stewardship, her family slowly rebuilding connection not through expectation but respect. And Margaret understood that the greatest power she reclaimed had never been ownership of a business, but authorship of her own final chapters, a life no longer defined by what others believed she should surrender, but by what she decided to keep, her voice, her legacy, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that when she finally rested, it would be on her own terms. That's all for today's story. If this resonated with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. This is Storyova, where your story matters. And I'll see you in the next one.